Good evening and welcome to the Mark I Medical Austere Responder course. This course was designed with the idea of training medical personnel to respond safely into disaster situations or the aftermath of disaster situations. This is the first evening of the course and provides a brief description of disasters. As we go through this course, please keep these objectives in mind. We're going to attempt to define disaster, which you'll find is actually more difficult than you think, discuss the impact of disasters on communities, and introduce different types of disaster that can occur, and then finally we'll wrap it up with identifying some common themes in health issues that occur during and in the aftermath of many disasters. As you look at this slide, please start in the 11 o'clock position. You're looking at 5 different types of disasters. The first one at 11 o'clock is a cloud of smoke over the city of Austin in 2010. This was as a result of the Bastrop Complex fire, which not only had tremendous economic damage, wildlife damage, state parks were destroyed, it also created a public health issue with all the smoke that traveled for hundreds to thousands of miles. In the 1 o'clock position, you are looking at 2 firefighters that are trying to put out the fire of a motor vehicle accident. What you have to consider, because you may be thinking, well, that's not a disaster, that's just a car wreck, is disasters when the resources that are available are not enough to handle what is going on in that particular situation. In a rural community, a car wreck that involves 3 to 5 patients and there's only 1 ambulance or 1 fire truck, that may be considered a disaster to them. It just has to do with what's available to that situation, which is one of the reasons that makes disaster a term that is difficult to define. Going to the 4 o'clock position, you're looking at a newspaper clipping from the Wall Street crash in the 1930s. That was an economic disaster that led to a sequelae of a displaced population and took this nation several years to recover from. In the 6 o'clock position, you're looking at a church in the aftermath of the 2010 Haitian earthquake that occurred, a devastating earthquake to that very already poor island. And then in the 7 o'clock position, the final image is of a federal disaster response truck that is in a flooding zone after Hurricane Katrina impacted New Orleans. So throughout the years, and as I was researching this topic, every definition I found seemed too broad or too narrow to actually encompass the term when it came to this course. So we're going to stick with this definition. I'll let you read it on your own, but essentially what I want you to pick out of that is it's a non-routine event. It is the exception to the rule, and a key component is it exceeds the capacity of the impacted area to respond effectively. The key components that are impacted are the health and lives of the people in that community and their property, as well as in the sequelae afterwards. Can they maintain social and economic stability in the aftermath of that particular disaster? When you look at disasters, there are 2 big umbrellas. The first one is man-made disasters versus natural disasters. This slide is depicting man-made disasters, and if you look closely, you'll see that we can further subdivide it. I've just subdivided it into accidental and intentional. Accidental is anything that results as man-made. Think industry, so chemical spills, chemical fires, industrial plants that have accidents, radiation leaks from power plants, things like that tend to be accidental, but they are indeed man-made. And then we go to intentional, which unfortunately in our world we're seeing more and more. Intentional is the wanton destruction to produce terror or to produce damage. There are 2 types of intentional. It's terrorism and bioterrorism. Some people will argue that that's the same thing. The key is people are doing it to other people to evoke a response. As you look at these pictures, the first picture in the 11 o'clock position is a picture of the USS Cole. It was assaulted by a small boat that had explosives in it. Obviously that was intentional attack, intentional disaster. The next one, which may be more difficult to see in the 2 o'clock position, is a picture of the BP oil spill with all the oil slipping on top of the surface and affecting the Gulf Coast. In the 4 o'clock position, that is a picture of a chemical plant in Waxahachie, Texas that caught on fire. And then another intentional example is in the 7 o'clock position, and that is a picture of the Murray Federal Building in Oklahoma City after it was bombed by Timothy McVeigh. The other large category of disasters is natural disasters, and unfortunately this month we have been experiencing the first one, which is cyclonic disasters. Within that category you have hurricanes and tornadoes. Typhoons are also considered that. Typhoons are simply hurricanes of a different name on the other side of the world. If you'd watched the news this week, you would have seen the devastating tornado that ripped through Moore, Oklahoma. And a couple weeks ago we had to deal with a lethal tornado that ripped through Granbury, Texas. I was vacationing in Granbury during that time, and it became very interesting couple of days. The next category is earthquakes. I don't know if you know it. If you talk about earthquakes in the United States, most of us think California and the West Coast. However, we have what's called the Madrid Fault Line, which actually bisects the United States and goes from Louisiana all the way up through Michigan. And should we have an earthquake with that fault line, we are going to be in a world of hurt in the United States. Wildfires is a huge issue that we have to deal with this year. Most of the Southwest is in a pretty horrific drought, which increases the likelihood of wildfires. In New Mexico, we've already started to experience them in the Sandia Mountains, and it's going to drain a lot of the Forest Service resources as well as their budget. If you've been paying attention to the news, we've been looking at the H7N9 avian influenza bird flu in China. It seems to be dying out if you follow the World Health Organization posts. But one of the things that they're worried about that is that it turns into a human-to-human transmission. With it having a 30% mortality, it would quickly spread throughout the entire world, making it a pandemic. The picture you're looking at is actually from the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic pandemic, which killed 30% of the population at that time. And then the final one is floods and landslides. I live in the desert, and actually flooding is a problem because we cannot handle large amounts of water. However, in other parts of the country, floods are a big issue, and they have to deal with them on a seasonal basis when rivers flood or there's been too much water in one specific area that it can't drain quickly. As we go forward, consider all of these and the public health problems that we see afterwards, and I'll try and point those out farther into the lecture. The other thing I want you to consider is that one disaster almost inevitably leads into another disaster. The first picture that you were looking at was a powerful wave causing the 2011 Japanese tsunami. This wave is pretty profound. I'll let you look at it again. Caused massive structural damage to the coastal cities along the Japanese coast. And what happened with that is, from the structural damage, it caused infrastructure damage. That means that their power was out, their sewage systems were damaged, the ability to communicate was damaged, homes, hospitals, and buildings were no longer safe to occupy. This subsequently displaced the population and put many of them in shelters. Then you had the radiation exposure from the structural damage in the original wave, and that created a public health emergency. The other thing that you have to consider is that anytime you group people together, you have the likelihood of a public health emergency. So in any disaster, as a medical provider, you have to have that in the top of your mind. Now, what's the impact of disaster? Well, first is, to me, what the commonsensical one. It's the physical damage that occurs. My house is gone, these trees are gone, this area is gone, is physically damaged, and you have rubble. That alone creates a hazard, especially for responders coming in. The other aspect is a social aspect. We don't often think about this, and the other new trend is social media and interacting via social media. But this is a picture of what appears to be two young lovers in the SARS epidemic of 2003 in Tokyo, Japan. You know, that creates a huge impact on being able to communicate and interact with each other. In Toronto, they attempted to do quarantines, and most people tolerated being quarantined for about 2 weeks. And then they started feeling the economic impact, needed to pay their mortgage, and wanted to go back to work. Psychosocial is a huge part of disaster response. If you've ever seen this photo before, you may recall that this is a firefighter that pulled a 2-year-old out of the rubble of the Oklahoma City bombing. There was a lot of rumor associated with this photograph. The biggest rumor was that this firefighter subsequently commit suicide later on because he couldn't handle the fact that he could not save her. That is a rumor. That is a misnomer. I've known people that have talked to this gentleman afterwards. But if you want to take another look at psychosocial aspect, how have we changed our behavior as a society since 9/11? That terroristic act has changed almost everything we do and how we look at people. Sociodemographic. What you're looking at is a task force search and rescue assigned to all. Anytime a task force goes in and they do search and rescue in a given area, they will mark the houses that they've gone through, how many bodies that they've had, how many victims they found live. Is it structurally capable to move back into, or is it going to fall apart? With sociodemographic, consider Hurricane Katrina. The population of New Orleans prior to Hurricane Katrina was mostly African American. After that event, it's actually changed, and a lot of African Americans chose not to go back to that city, whereas a lot of Hispanics chose to move there. So the majority is now the Hispanic and Latino population. So socioeconomic is huge. In 2012, FEMA actually ran out of its disaster budget in October. They had 4 months left of the year, but they had spent all of their money on disasters that had already occurred. You take a look at insurance companies that have to go in and pay for things that have been destroyed. The city of West had a chemical plant explosion not more than a month ago, and I spent a lot of time in West, and I spoke with the mayor, and he said 2 of the small insurance companies that were there, Neighbors Helping Neighbors, have actually gone bankrupt because they could not handle the load of people that needed their entire household replaced. And then there's political fallout. Seems like every time there's a disaster, people want somebody to blame. If you recognize this gentleman, you'll recognize him as Michael Brown. He was deemed responsible for the federal response to Hurricane Katrina and deemed a failure with that response and promptly lost his job. Every disaster has common health issues that come into play, and since this is a course for medical responders, I wanted to focus on these. The first is social reactions. If you've been watching the TV for the last few days, you know, the people that have been impacted by the Moore, Oklahoma tornado, they're distraught, they're upset. They're also experiencing some resilience in that we will rebuild. You can actually sociologically look at those reactions and predict when they're going to occur. You have to worry about communicable diseases. Anytime you put somebody in a given area with other people, the risk of a communicable disease increases. In the event of a flood, you have to consider that Legionella cases go up, and what are some other public health issues that are going to occur. Population displacements are huge. If you aren't displaced or in a local area, can you go to work? No. If you cannot go to work, can you maintain your income and can you pay your bills? No. So anytime you displace a population, one, it's a burden on the population that is receiving people from a disaster area. Crime tends to go up. It went up in the Houston area after the Hurricane Katrina evacuees arrived. It's just a huge stressful situation. And think about if you were displaced You no longer knew what your home looked like. You only had what you could carry in your two hands, and you're living in a 10 by 10 foot square open area in a shelter next to somebody that you may or may not know. Privacy is gone. Food and nutrition do become an issue. A lot of people think, okay, we're going to get MREs in there to help. MRE is a meal ready to eat for the military. If you think about our elderly population, they don't do well on a very calorie, carbohydrate, salt-rich diet, which these MREs are full of. Many of the MREs are a 2,000 calorie diet in and of itself because it was not designed for the purpose of disaster response. And the other thing is the water safe to drink? So are you getting enough to eat, and are you making sure that what you're eating is safe? If you have an underlying mental health problem, a disaster situation can actually exacerbate that. If you don't, think about the stress that's associated with having to relocate, having lost a loved one, fear of the future of what's going to happen to you and your family. It does create a stressful situation. You may not be sleeping very well at all, and so that's the type of people that you're dealing with. If you're a responder, you have to soak in all of those people dealing with all of those issues and make sure that you don't let it affect you to a degree where you take it home. Many of us do, and we'll discuss that on a different week. Damage to the health infrastructure is something that occurs on a fairly regular basis. Again, looking at the Moore, Oklahoma tornado that occurred a couple days ago. A hospital in Moore, Oklahoma was completely wiped out. They had to evacuate 100% of those patients. If you're in a disaster area, that is your local area, that's where your local provider is, that's now damaged, you can't go there. And then finally, in any disaster you have to consider, is the water supply safe? In the 2008 Hurricane Ike that occurred that hit near Houston, they were within hours of running out of power for the generators to keep the water supply safe. So essentially sewage was about to go into the water supply. And due to lack of communication, due to infrastructure damage, they may not have been able to get that message out into the population. So, in the last 15 minutes I've done a very brief overview of disasters and disaster responses and the types of disasters. Where this is the full 50-minute course, I would actually take a few minutes to go into and ask students what they experience. Many people have been either in a disaster or their family has been impacted by a disaster, and everybody will offer something different, and that would be the interactive portion. Hopefully you've gained something out of this, and I look forward to your feedback.